It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by Agile Dad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. Did you know the top performing CEOs in Fortune 500 companies spend significantly more time thinking strategically and long term? Part of this has to be a byproduct of running larger companies successfully. As company size grows, you need to elevate yourself out of the weeds towards a more long-term view. This is part of the growth strategy when people are inside of companies that are just breaking out of the startup mentality and getting into growth. This is a typical thing that you see. So, another part is the importance of balancing their short-term tactical work with the long-term strategic intent. Although some of the best performing CEOs spend more time thinking long term, this still has to be balanced against other time horizons and deliverables. The truth is, very few CEOs spent more than half their time thinking long term. The highest performing were those who still had a healthy balance between their long term, midterm, and short term perspectives. If unbalanced, you often see a high level strategy, but nothing that connects it to the everyday work. It's like having that vision without having a strategy. Strategy, therefore, is not just a single horizon. It's not what you would classify as long term, but rather it's a continuum of long, mid, and short term. The constant debate about strategy versus tactics, planning versus execution, and vision versus tactics leaves us often behaving as though these are all mutually exclusive when the truth is they're not. This happens all the time, especially when it comes to organizational structure. There's a notion that there's some invisible line inside your org chart where strategy just hocus pocus magically happens, that there's no long term vision related to the strategy or no strategy that's related to an expressed vision. What I can tell you is in our document, the Agile Meetings Playbook, we refer to this. We talk about this. We say that there has to be more of a North Star vision and strategy that's generated at the leadership level. I often refer to this as organizational vision and strategy because that's a good way to look at it versus the product level strategy, which does thread through and tie to the organization vision and strategy. In other words, you have to have both. You can't just have one without the other. Developing a strategy without considering tactics would be like choosing your next holiday destination without consideration of how you're going to get there. I mean, it's an easy problem. And sometimes we do it. We get so excited about the destination that we often forget what happens in between. Although I have had some people argue, that's fine. Empowerment and leadership to provide the destination and not to prescribe the how is just fine. It is fine until you discover you don't have a valid passport, or the budget to secure a necessary visa, or you don't have the vaccines needed to enter a specific country, or that it may be dangerous and there may be a State Department issue warning saying not to go to that country. So without tactical strategies, you're missing the most important piece. You're missing the piece of the puzzle that connects the day to day work to the longer term objective or vision. As a result, companies end up with this gap between strategic intent and their day to day execution. So it might be easy to picture this if you did a line chart where you drew a two-dimensional plane or a two by two matrix, if you will, like a two-dimensional plan, and you put breadth across the top and depth down. If you did this on one axis, on the breadth axis, this is talking about how broad your strategy is, how encompassing your North Star is. The first part of the breadth has to do with scoping aspect. For example, setting a strategy for the entire organization is way broader than setting a strategy for an entire product. Similarly, a company strategy would be narrower than setting a strategy for an entire country. So if you think about it from that perspective, you need to align the breadth of your strategy. The second aspect of breadth is how far outside of that scope do you consider? So, for example, do you consider the impacts of other aspects of the business or even externally to the industry, market? How will our sales group use it? How will marketing, etc.? How are we planning on scaling? Are we moving to different axes in the future? The other axis is what we refer to as depth. So, depth has to do with when you consider things from both a high level and a low level. Do you only consider a 10,000-foot view, or do you have a high attention to detail at the same time? Some people, for example, are brilliant at thinking big and bold, but come undone by the small details. Equally, the opposite is true. Some people get lost on the small details and they have an inability to think big. Others get stuck in the weeds and just don't find their way in either direction. The truth is, in order to be successful as a leader, you really do need both. It's the ability to think big while challenging yourself on the finer details that helps you grow. This doesn't mean that you're dictating or micromanaging. It's about finding the right balance. There'll be times when you want to zoom right in and other times where you want to keep it zoomed out. The lens has to be in the right focus, the right aperture. Part of the skill of building effective strategies is obviously finding that golden fidelity, that place where you need to be, the gold thread, and that's not always easy. So, take into consideration, for example, a narrow and shallow strategy. Narrow and shallow strategies are the worst kind. They're not too dissimilar from a broad and shallow, but they lack breadth of consideration. Instead, they lack the wide considerations that broad strategies have, and as a result, they're full of fluff. Narrow and shallow strategies are the ones that look like someone wrote it down on a napkin while trying to rush out of the door. The lack of thought, consideration, or substance makes them the worst possible strategy. It's just bad all the way around. An example of a narrow versus broad strategy would be like a high level product strategy. If someone says something like, "We want to be the best in class with our mobile app," or "We want to be the number one provider of our service in the country," or "We want to provide an optimal experience for all of our customers." Ah, none of these strategies really describe how. It's just, or they don't even go why. It's let's boil the ocean. Bring me a rock. You hear me talk about that one a lot, right? But it's just we need to ask ourselves the question. Why? Why do we care about this? What does it mean for our business? What does it mean for our people internally? Those narrow and shallow strategies are akin to a vision or goal, but they're not necessarily the execution piece. And I think that's where people get lost. That's where people get mixed up. They want to focus on one, but they often don't take into consideration that you need more than that. A good strategy should tell you not just what, but it should give you some of the how it's going to be achieved. It should clearly state what you're choosing and what you're not choosing to do. I think that's the most important part. Shallow strategies often lack the level of necessary detail. Remaining too high level and fluffy makes it really difficult to be actionable and driven. If you have a narrow but deep strategy, on the other hand, they're highly focused details. And there's nothing inherently wrong with narrow but deep. However, the detail can often give a false sense of confidence. Due to the narrow nature, external factors are often blindsided in narrow but deep strategies. Without investing the time to go broad and consider a wider range of influences, narrow strategies come undone by external events. This doesn't mean they'll always fail, but it's a continual thing. You have to continually plan. You have to inspect and adapt and respect the empirical process. As long as you're continually reviewing your strategy and making changes when necessary, you can pivot when you need to and make those fine tuning adjustments. But I think the one thing that we know about any kind of vision or strategy is that it's always subject to change, and that it will change frequently. That as you have discovery and learn more about your customers, your products, and services, that strategy is going to change. And if you don't consider broader impacts with regard to the business strategy, the market, competitors, other influences from the outside, these things get blindsided by external factors and they're full of change. So, when you consider external factors, you need to make sure you understand maybe what your competitors are doing or what their go to market strategies are. But narrow strategies specifically, often lack cohesion with other strategies in the business. If you think of a product strategy without considering the company strategy, you may be completely off target and not being driven in the right direction. So let's flip it and talk about broad and shallow. So if you have a broad and shallow strategy, it can seem like a bad recipe, but not always. Broad and shallow strategies are strategies that are high level, but have considered a wide range of aspects. Trying to think of an example. An example of broad and shallow strategy would be a company strategy that doesn't go into the depth of the how too much, but gives you enough information to have direction. Broad and shallow strategies are the most effective in large organizations that wish to create space for agency and autonomy. In small organizations, there's still a need for the depth of discovery, but in a large company, oftentimes this type of shallow approach works really, really well. Um, this can be tricky to get the balance correct because you don't want to be too high level, but you also don't want to be too detailed. You need to get into that just right zone where this bed's too soft, this bed's too hard. You need to find everything that's just right. The blind spot for broad but shallow strategies is that they can easily become too high level or fluffy. When this happens, they become disconnected from the day to day work, and people are just like, sail well. Our strategy is to get there, right? It can be misinterpreted, it can be twisted. Let's talk about the last one, broad and deep strategy. So, if you have a broad and deep strategy, this is well considered, detailed, and informed by data and research. It's immensely powerful when done right for the right level of context. They consider a wide range of possibilities, influences, and inputs. The problem is sometimes these go too detail, and it becomes hyper focused on the how and the what and the why. And sometimes you end up just being you become a dictator if you're driving with this kind of strategy. So I think it's worth identifying and recognizing that organizations behave differently. And this is why there's so much confusion around vision and strategy, and how vision, strategy, and tactics aren't always tied together with the thread that they should be. So I hope this was useful. It's a longer episode. If you have a question or concern, much like one of my coaches did who asked me this question, you can feel free to reach out to me at learnmore@agiledad.com, where we'd love to learn more about what you want to hear. And as always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.